I'm Big Don Luka, smoke you like my hookah. Pump fake right, then I step back in illusion. That's a boss move maneuver, billionaire entrepreneur. Mark Cuban on the viewer, put you rookies on a skewer. I stay shitting on you boys like I came up from the sewer. Used to have a lot of dollars, now I got a lot fewer. What you saying to me? I hope you save it for me. I'm about to kill the game, and I put it in my testimony.
Hi, welcome to the Mainstream Mavs podcast. This is your host, Will. I'm joined here by my co-host, Jaren. Today, we are going to be into the Mavericks 127-117 win over the New Orleans Pelicans and the Mavericks 120-109 loss versus the Oklahoma City Thunder yesterday. We're just going to be going over the Mavericks back-to-back slate over the weekend. There's obviously a lot of interesting things that sort of happened over the weekend. We saw the ascension of Jaden Hardy into the rotation after the Mavericks waived Kemba Walker. So that's something we're going to be going over. Obviously going over the Mavericks loss to the Thunder and how dry they looked without Luka Doncic. In games where the Mavericks have not had Luka Doncic this season, they are now 0-4, which continued against the Thunder. It was a very predictable sort of game that you kind of saw coming to an extent when you saw the news that the Mavericks were going to be sort of load managing or quote unquote resting Luka. There's a lot of different things to get into with these two games, of course, and we'll be getting all into it here. But before we do that, here's an ad from our sponsor, Anchor. All right, Jaren. So getting into this one versus the Pelicans, first off, the Mavericks' first game on this little weekend slate where they were actually able to win. This is the one, of course, that Luka played in. So, starting off in this one, it was pretty evident from the start that Luka had it going, as he has been in this stretch, of course, where he's just been, completely unstoppable and unguardable, however you want to denote that. I mean, so he was, getting to his spots, manipulating the pick and roll with Valanciunas back there, trying to protect the paint and stuff. He did a really good job. Really trying to bring Valanciunas, of course, he's more of a drop coverage big up on those screens, and was able to facilitate to Wood and Powell right off the bat there pretty easily. And they were doing really good. But Dwight Powell and Christian Wood both picked up 2 early fouls, just trying to make their presence known against Valanciunas down low, trying to limit him defensively, of course, as he is quite the mammoth down there in the paint, and tends, especially against, those undersized centers like a Wood or a Powell, to really, furbish his presence inside. And, as much as they may try to counter it and, play defense with their hands straight up, inevitably, just due to sheer size, they're going to pick up a few fouls. And they both picked up 2 quick fouls early on in that first quarter. And in came JaVale McGee, who actually had one of his more positive impacts in the season. Yeah. He had actually a crazy block dunk, I believe it was, on Valanciunas. Or was it? Yeah, if my memory is slipping me, but it could have been.
I think it was Valanciunas.
I believe it was Valanciunas. Actually looked pretty active defensively. Somehow was able to make his little skyhook floater thing on offense. And just kind of filled in all the important gaps that the Mavericks sorely need from a rim protector. Just in that little stretch, of course. Now, he didn't play a ton in the OKC game, and he only really got, I think, 13 or 14 minutes in totality in that New Orleans game. And by no means am I declaring JaVale McGee a cure-all, or the fact that I think that this is reprimanding what, the atrocities that we saw from him early on in the season. But what did you have to make of his resurgence there in the first quarter, and him seemingly becoming this solid veteran rim protector for 5 minutes all of a sudden?
Yeah, I mean, he actually looked like a basketball player for parts of that game. He had amazing 3 blocks. I think 2 of them were probably pretty goaltendish, but with that being said, it still was registered as 3 blocks. But yeah, I mean, he's just able to bring a sense of, I guess, rim protecting that, Christian Wood and Dwight Powell can't really do. I know Christian Wood has really improved on his blocking shot blocking in terms of this last 15 game stretch in his time starting. But even still, JaVale McGee, he's known as a rim protector. and just about the only rim protector on this team. So for him to really come in there and actually put a body on Valanciunas, who beforehand had really just been getting whatever he wanted. I mean, Valanciunas' hands, like he's able to catch the ball from pretty much anywhere and pretty much able to put the ball. Doesn't matter if he's being triple teamed or anything, he can put the ball in the hoop. And JaVale McGee was pretty adamant on, he was defending him really well in this 15 minutes.
We've seen a few of these one-off games from JaVale where he just out of nowhere kind of taps back into his old self. Do you feel like this situation was more emblematic of that, or do you think we actually might see a continued resurgence from JaVale up until this point in the season now that we are officially 41 games through?
I mean, it's definitely the games, or more of the games than not. Recently, we've seen some positive JaVale McGee games, but even still, I think with Maxey, with his injury, until he comes back, we're gonna have to rely on McGee a little more than I think we will later in the season. I feel like Maxey's injury, I want to say, is only a few weeks to a month left until that's his allotted time to be back. But even still, whenever McGee can come in, inevitably, Christian Wood, Dwight Powell, they're going to get in some foul trouble whenever they're playing these bigger defenders. So to have a guy like McGee be pretty much your third string, I don't feel comfortable, but I'm okay with the Mavericks having that, especially if McGee is playing this well.
Yeah. I think that McGee's contract that the Mavs gave him over the summer is still viewed as an albatross. Like I feel like a few one-off games isn't going to change the prerogative in terms of how we view him and how, unproductive he's been throughout stretches this season. But the more that he is able to provide some rim protection, especially in a game, the Mavericks still, like in that OKC game, really didn't play him much, basically out of a lack of need to play him. There's no really dominant opposing 7-foot center on the other hand that, is going to go back and play drop coverage and, primarily operate in the post and the dunker spot like a Valanciunas. Obviously you don't want McGee having to stretch out to the perimeter on any sort of stretch 5 or anything like that. So, I think maybe throughout stretches he can contribute every now and then, as we've seen throughout this season. And if he starts to flip the narrative, then more power to him. Like I would love for him to prove me wrong. But as of now, I really just don't, I was happy with that performance to say the least. And he did look active defensively. He actually looked like he was attacking the glass and had a few decent offensive possessions that weren't along the lines of what the absolute are you doing out there, basically. Because he has had some possessions where he taps into some of those Shaqtin' a Fool McGee plays and kind of just makes some really dumb decisions. Like I remember like one time, it was over the last few weeks when we were in garbage time and he caught the ball like wide open in the paint and just like his momentum had him like backpedaling so far that he had to like just throw it before he got out of bounds. So he's still if he's eliminating those moments and we're seeing more positives than not, then the case for him to, I still think he's very largely expendable come trade deadline. I don't know how much the Mavericks will actually act on that. That's going to be for our 41 game pod that we're going to probably get to here either tonight or tomorrow. But I do think that, he can at least see a few minutes in the rotation if he continues to play like this, which, we can hope for, but I'm not putting too much stock in, especially with his start to the season. Also in that first quarter, the Pelicans' really only source of offense throughout this game really came via Najee. Oh, of course, those Valanciunas plays as he really particularly got going more so in the third and fourth quarter. But the only really people that they had at the point of attack were Jose Alvarado and Najee Marshall. And I think the Mavericks were quick to adjust to an extent. As soon as they started bringing McKinley Wright and Jaden Hardy off the bench to guard Alvarado, they had the foot speed, and Frank for that matter, Frank Ntilikina as well. They kind of had the foot speed to be able to stay with him a little more. And it didn't seem like he was making as much of an impact. Najee Marshall was essentially their only like guy who could furbish any sort of offense for himself on multiple levels, just due to his, size and his ability to, I wouldn't want to really say, I wouldn't necessarily say play make, but his ability to get downhill, I think, is what really impressed me. Really come off screens and attack. He is a he is a threat to score to an extent. And those things definitely, I thought, were hampering the Mavericks a little bit in that first half, especially when, Tim Hardaway Jr. And Dinwiddie were matched up on Marshall and Alvarado respectively. I particularly remember like a lot of possessions where Tim was just getting blown by instantly by Alvarado. And I mean, I think Reggie saw a lot of time on Najee Marshall, and he was kind of really just able to overpower him a lot of the time, using his body to bully his way past Reggie. But like I said, once the flurry of guards came in off the bench and Hardy, McKinley Wright, and Frank Ntilikina, they really seemed to, at least maybe not Marshall as much, but they definitely seemed to slow down Alvarado a lot more within those stretches, just because I thought the foot speed there was a lot better versus when they had Tim on him. Were you impressed by the Mavericks' defensive effort, I guess, really in totality against the Pelicans in this game, having them when the Pelicans, of course, put up 117 points in this game, yet there were, stretches where it seemed like there was a lid on the basket for the Pelicans and they basically had no shot creation with, but, obviously they had McCollum, Zion, and Brandon Ingram out and Larry Nance. So obviously they were missing a plethora of their players. And, I probably should have prefaced that at the beginning of the podcast that they were very shorthanded, because it kind of takes away from the impressiveness of this win for sure. But were you impressed with the Mavericks defensive effort on this night, or do you think that it's kind of an indictment upon them that they had to tap into some of their guards off the bench just to be able to, guard a Jose Alvarado and Devontae Graham, who has been struggling so far this season?
No, so I think, defensively, the Mavericks, they got lucky, to say the least. For me, I wasn't all too impressed. I just think, at times it looked like the rotations were a little late, especially on the pick and roll. Valanciunas, in that second half really got things going. He finished with 25, which I want to say majority of that was really in that third and fourth quarter. But yeah, I wouldn't say I was too impressed with the Mavericks. I know at times it really did seem like they were playing good defense, but I think it was more so just the lid on the basket effect. But more so, especially in that starting unit, whenever it was Alvarado matched up against Hardaway. I know that you alluded to this earlier, but Hardaway was just seemingly letting him blow by, and Jose Alvarado was getting easy buckets at the basket. Same thing with Najee Marshall. I think he's more of an impressive offensive player than what Alvarado's given. But even still, whenever your top defender, Reggie Bullock's matched against, or I would say top defender in this stretch with all these guys out, but your top defenders matched up against Najee Marshall, and Marshall's able to pretty much blow by him as well and get to the hoop with ease. I wouldn't say I was too impressed. There was times, where the Mavericks definitely clutched up, but with that being said, I just think, more so in that first half, especially, it was just the Pelicans just couldn't get anything to fall.
Yeah, I mean, not to mention like Kyra Lewis, he came in for Alvarado, and it was only, I think, his maybe third game of the season. He'd been coming off some sort of knee injury, I believe. And he bared the same effect upon Tim Hardaway that Alvarado did, just in terms of being able to blow by him, got out in transition really fast, quicker, smaller guard, of course. But yeah, I mean, I definitely don't think that it was wildly impressive defensively. At least I think the Mavericks had a really good offensive game that we'll get to.
Yeah, they were really good. Yeah.
But just from the standpoint that the Pelicans were missing all, everybody who, I mean, honestly, their top three usage players in Zion, Brandon Ingram, and McCollum, basically all their primary sources of offense. And that's not to say that their flurry of role players that they have to supplement for when these guys are missing time is not impressive. They obviously have one of the best supporting casts in the NBA. But, we do have to recognize that while a Najee Marshall or a Trey Murphy III, while those guys have elements of their game that they can provide in terms of being able to offer some shot creation and the ability to tack off a closeout or, shoot over the top of guys and when somebody goes under a screen. Well, they have those sort of abilities of, basically self-offensive creation. Those obviously aren't the strong suits of their game. And those things are kind of facilitated by somebody like a Brandon Ingram or a Zion or CJ McCollum really running things at the point of attack and opening things up for those guys to make life on them easier. So, the fact that, outside of, kind of a rough shooting game by Trey Murphy, and he just really didn't get it going in this one in terms of his shot volume that he had. I'm not going to sit here and act like it was wildly impressive. I mean, it could have been worse, like Alvarado or Kyra Lewis could have easily went off for like 30 or something. But I mean, the Mavericks did allow 5 guys in double figures. Most of those, 14 points or above in a game where the Pelicans, while their role players are impressive, and it's not to take away from them by any means, but idealistically, you'd like to see the Mavericks be able to hone in and limit some of those guys who really don't have just the diversification in terms of the skill set of their game to be able to, like you're not going to be able to see Najee Marshall go to another team and be, a lead guy consistently by any means, right? He's only be able to do that because he gets things opened up for him by these star players for the Pelicans. So, it definitely wasn't impressive from that standpoint that the Mavericks, especially in that second and first quarter when they were kind of just getting blown by. And like Herb Jones had 16 points in this game. I think he made 1 of 3 threes, and everything else was basically just him getting an offensive rebound or he had 5 steals, just getting out in transition, running the floor and beating the Mavericks, or, catching somebody sleeping. I know Luka was matched up on him and when Luka was playing defense a lot of the time, just getting caught sleeping on a backdoor cut or a V cut or things of that nature. Anytime he's getting downhill, like for him to be able to score 16 points in a game like this, it definitely points towards the Mavericks, definitely having one of their more weaker defensive efforts of the year. This is not one where I'd blame Powell or Wood in terms of their minutes because obviously they were asked to, guard the Lithuanian. I was going to come up with an analogy for Valanciunas. The Lithuanian Loch Ness monster. There we go. And they were tasked to, deal with the burden of him. And we all know just personnel wise, like that's unfair to ask them. It comes down to, the Mavericks having no really other options, besides supplementary 14 minutes from JaVale McGee or whatever, however much minutes you can expel from JaVale, which is not going to be a lot.
Yeah.
But, it's obviously unfair to task those guys with having to be able to guard Valanciunas all game. So I feel like his offensive output was pretty predictable, and I'm not really too, displeased at him getting 25 and 10, but, I guess the Mavericks' point of attack defense and their perimeter defense was lackluster to say the absolute least. But I mean, at the end of the day, it comes down to Reggie Bullock and his inconsistent defensive deficiencies, where he has some games where he seems like he's a player still capable of the output that he was showing on that end last year, and some games where his defensive effort is comparable to Tim Hardaway Jr. It comes down to that sort of fluctuation. And it comes down, again, like we said in previous spots, to all these guys being injured. When you don't have Josh Green, Dorian Finney-Smith out there, and, and you have Luka, Spencer, Reggie, and, McKinley Wright and Jaden Hardy, while they put in great defensive effort, McKinley Wright and Jaden Hardy, they don't have like the most insane measurables, particularly like Wright, to be able to stop some of these like bigger guys, just because of how, you can really only kind of task them with guarding point guards before you see their defensive shelf life start to come to an end, just because, the size factor and, Hardy still need to add some strength on him and things of that nature. So, they have limitations there, and it kind of just comes down to personnel with all these injuries, why the Mavericks perimeter defense has been suffering so much, as we saw both in the New Orleans game and the Thunder game.
Yeah. For me, in terms of at least Reggie Bullock, I feel like you put a tweet out about this. When does it become the narrative of like, this guy, he's coming along. It's only a matter of time to maybe this is the Reggie Bullock we're getting now. Inconsistent. We of course have his one-off games like he had against Oklahoma City, where I think he had like 8 points on pretty decent shooting. Just the defense, the foot speed, the agility, it's just not what it used to be. He's having to be relied upon to be like the number one guy, whether it's off the bench or starting unit defensively, like around the perimeter. And I mean, he clearly hasn't come up to the task of being that We've had to rely on, Frank Ntilikina, Jaden Hardy's coming there. He's done decent. Even, McKinley Wright, he's on his 2-way contract, but he's done a really good job defensively. I mean, when does it become these guys are just taking, Band-Aids pretty much for Reggie Bullock's absence?
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely credence to the fact that they're coming in and honestly like filling more of a void defensively than what he's leaving. Despite, I obviously alluded to Hardy and Wright still having some progression that they're going to have to go through.
Yeah.
I mean, particularly I guess Wright, like I feel like his defensive potential is really at its climax, just given his size limitations. He gives really good effort. He has good length despite his height, and he's able to guard kind of like 1 through 2, but he just has limitations because of his size. But for Hardy, it's just more of an adding on strength thing and some of his intangibles on rotations and things, just typical rookie defensive mistakes. It's hard for any rookie to play defense in the NBA, but I think Hardy's done a pretty good job filling in. He's got a couple steals in these last where he's got a few like really savvy off-ball ones, a couple ones where he just rotates well and sometimes able to stay in front of his man and get just a steal, basically head up on a player. So he's had a few impressive possessions. I don't think I've seen enough of a sample size to come in and say that he's a strong defender quite yet by any means, but I love the progression that I've seen from both of those guys. And in the current rendition of Reggie Bullock, who is continuing to a lot of the time just kind of getting shot over with virtually not even a hand going up from Bullock or just getting beat off the dribble time and time again. He is pretty crisp on his rotations. I will give him that. There aren't a lot of times where I'm like, oh, Reggie missed that rotation and there's a guy wide open in the corner, but it's just more of a lack of being able to stick onto a guy. He has the veteran savviness to be able to play the mental aspect of defense, of course, but you start to question, is there a shelf life in terms of his athleticism catching up to him, his age catching up to him at all, in terms of how much longer he can be an elite defender? Because right now he's definitely not an elite defender. Maybe at one point in his career he was. I think last year, I don't know if I'd even go as far as to label him that, but I would definitely say he was a good above average defender. So that's something to monitor going forward. And, you hate to see that in a game like this. But he did shoot good in the OKC game, but I still didn't really think that he did anything different defensively to change that narrative within my head. So we'll have to see how that irons out, but it's definitely something to monitor going forward. He obviously flipped the script in a huge way at this point last year, where his 3-pointer started coming along, and how intense in terms of how he played defense, particularly when you get matched up on somebody at the top of the key. It seemed like he was getting after it more versus just kind of at this point, it just seems like he's like basically, crying for help sometimes, just trying to stay in front of guys, like barely able to do so. It just seems like that sort of aggressiveness has been lost to an extent. So I haven't quite seen he's shooting a little bit better, of course, than at the beginning stretch of the season, but I haven't seen like the, I just by the eye test, I don't really know if there's like a way to really describe it, but I haven't really seen like the attitude shift from him of like him tapping into, his apex as a 3-and-D player. Like he just doesn't seem like he's like ready for that. He almost seems like that is like quite a ways away. I wouldn't like use the term scared, but he does seem like a little bit rattled for whatever reason, and like he's almost like holding something back at times. I've noticed that to an extent. So that's unfortunate. So hopefully that changes to something. But I do think at this point, if he continues to play like this, like you'd have to probably agree that he's one of the more expendable players on the team.
No, for sure. I think that this was a guy heading into this season where, like, without a doubt, I want a first round pick in return, or at least some valuable player in return. And now, I don't know how you view him, but is he a negative asset to you?
Yeah, I'd say at this point, like he's definitely a neutral to negative asset. Like he'll probably come in. He could help any playoff team in terms of shooting as long as he, continues upon his typical positive regression, even if it's he doesn't get above that 40% marker. If he can just shoot like 35 to 38%, he'll help any playoff team. But in terms of his defensive versatility, like there's definitely credence to the fact that that's waning. So that's something to definitely keep an eye out for as we proceed, especially now that we're at the halfway marker of the season. This is still a narrative, but he could easily turn around. We'll see, as he has in years past. But next up, let's go ahead and get into Christian Wood and Luka Doncic in this game. It was definitely, one of the more we're seeing it throughout this stretch how consistent they are, but I think this game specifically was definitely like one of their more dominant games together.
Yeah.
Because a lot of Christian Wood's points were just basically Luka abusing the pick and roll, involving Valanciunas in uncomfortable scenarios where he'd either have to, come up, and if he hedged even whatsoever, then there's going to be a pinpoint lob pass to Wood. I didn't feel like, in this game in particular, I thought Wood was a benefactor of Doncic's gravity that he was really hauling in, and any mismatches that he was able to get from that on any of the Pelicans, smaller defenders, any of their wings, he was able to take advantage of, even though they do have some pretty long defensively versatile wings. I think Wood did a really good job. Yeah, I think he's been doing a better job of realizing, when to shoot over the top of guys versus when to attack. I think early on in the season, he kind of got into a rut sometimes when there were some times where it was more opportune maybe for him to take advantage of a smaller mismatch. But he maybe made a 3 or so up until that point. So he would kind of just shoot over the top of guys. And there were some times where the paint was clogged and he would attack maybe when you'd wish that he wouldn't. But I think he's been a lot more uber efficient in terms of his shot diet and how he is really making his presence known within this Mavericks offense. And he's really using Luka as a tool to open things up for him. And everything really feels like very seamless within the offense.
Yeah.
I particularly noticed that much in this game. What did you think of the dynamism between both of them and how they were able to, structure, or how they were able to play together in the pick and roll?
Yeah. So, what game is this since Christian Wood has been starting? I feel like this is like game 15 or something like that. This Pelicans game.
It's got to be like in that 10 to 15 range.
Yeah. So yeah, somewhere in that 10 to 15 range. Just the fact that these guys, they seem so comfortable on the court together when running the pick and roll. And I know Valanciunas isn't the best defender in the world, but still, he's an intimidating figure, at least on the court, compared to a guy like Christian Wood. But for Luka, whether it's mismatch hunting or whatever he's doing, it just seems like the pick and roll is pretty much always there, and it's always there with Christian Wood. I know Valanciunas, yeah, like you mentioned, whenever he hedged, it just kind of seemed like, there was that awesome, whatever it was, that no-look lob pass.
Yeah,
that he had to Christian Wood.
Really thinking of in my head when I was saying
yeah. And that was all caused because, Valanciunas hedged on Luka, and Luka being Luka just throws it up, and it's an easy catch and lob for Christian Wood. But nonetheless, these guys are able to, whether it's pick and pop or pick and roll, they're able to abuse whatever matchup they get. I know Valanciunas, he's kind of reluctant to defend outside. And even if it's Christian Wood, it's just his slow foot speed doesn't really allow him to get to those closeout spots. And Christian Wood, I want to say he had actually a pretty productive, he went 4 of 7 from the 3-point line this game. And strictly because of the pick and pops, or whenever Luka would drive, he would just be wide open at the top of the key. And that's just what those two, with Luka, the sort of magnifying kind of guy he is, he's going to draw 2 defenders no matter where he is on the court. And that's going to leave someone inevitably open.
No, 100%. And I think you make a great point there, just in terms of how on a game-to-game basis, they're using whatever matchup is in front of them to determine how they played. I think Valanciunas was dropping almost every possession in the first half. So I think that they definitely deferred to the pick and pop more, and Wood was, making him pay, as he didn't want to come out to the perimeter and defend him. And, once he started to realize that he had to respect Wood's shooting, Wood is shooting 39.9% on threes this year. That's a hedge under 40%. He's honestly probably the Mavericks' best 3-point shooter right now. Just if we're distinguishing both volume and his actual percentage. I don't really know like if that's a far fetch. And I mean, I think that they're playing very smart in terms of like using things to be able to open up the game for them, whether they're starting out with the pick and pop, starting out with the pick and roll, of course, depending on the matchup, or if they're trying to operate in the short roll and Luka's getting doubled, using Wood, well, we've seen this kind of sparingly, but using him in the middle of the floor as a facilitator or a guy that can shoot over guys at the nail or the right above the dotted line area, like those are the sort of things that just those two guys on the court by themselves, in terms of the gravity that they attract, they can run a game offensively almost by themselves. If another team is shorthanded. And I mean, we saw a lot of like two big lineups in this game that were kind of interesting. I've noticed that Kidd is deferred to playing Powell and Wood together a little bit.
Yeah.
It kind of is pretty clunky on defense because one of those, I'm not really as concerned about Wood being matched up on a smaller guy versus I am Powell, who has a tendency to be able to get blown by way easier on those sort of matchups. But offensively, I will say the one burden it kind of does relieve. I kept, like asking myself, why is Jason Kidd keep playing Dwight Powell and Christian Wood together? Obviously, like Wood can stretch the floor, but these are two guys that you primarily have in a pick and roll action involved together offensively. It kind of just doesn't make any sense. But, to an extent, if you're using Powell as that role man, that's obviously going to have Valanciunas have to fall back on him. Hence, you're getting a lot of mismatches with Wood at on smaller guys on offense.
Yeah.
So I have noticed that has been a thing that he's ran with. Obviously you can point to a lack of center depth as to the reason that Jason Kidd might be doing that, but I can definitely see how it's opened up things offensively by running those two together. It's not a seamless fit by any means, but particularly when you have like one of those traditional like drop coverage bigs who's just going to sink back into the paint, by making Wood a 4 on offense, basically, I mean, that's going to diagnose a lot more mismatches for him and the ability for him to like get to the rim and draw fouls. He's upped his free throw percentage this year to 72.3%, which has been a nice revelation since he started, in those high 50s to lower 60s this year. He's been doing a better job getting to the line. So that's been good to see. And, I definitely wanted to talk about those two big lineups because that was something pretty distinguishable, particularly in that Pelicans game. The Pelicans have some two big lineups of their own with Jackson Hayes and Valanciunas, just because of how versatile Jackson Hayes is in terms of being like a defensive chess piece. He's very, very athletic and fast for his size. So he can guard under pretty well. And we saw that at times in the Mavericks game. Where he was able to stick some, occasionally, limit Luka a few times, things of that nature. The Pelicans just run into some issues on that end.
Yeah.
In terms of the offensive fit there. But I do think that they have something there, particularly when they're able to curate their lineups a little better and they have their full array of personnel. Playing those two guys together is an interesting look for them. And I honestly did not know that they ran that before we went into this game. I didn't know Jackson Hayes was involved in like so many two big lineups with Valanciunas, but that was cool to kind of see how they played him there. Barring that, Luka had a really good game, just facilitating and scoring from all three levels. It's so funny to like look at the shot diet of the Mavericks comparatively in the OKC game versus the Pelicans. I mean, I don't have access to second spectrum, but I'd be really curious to see like how much more wide open shots were generated in the Pelicans game versus the Thunder game without Luka, because I mean, you just see the magnitude that he draws in, like how much better looks the Mavericks can get when, he's the lead ball handler versus the Mavericks just having to do that by committee. I think that was something that was pretty easily identifiable seeing those two games. A lot of people talked about Luka's stat padding at the end of the Pelicans game where he I think he checked back in to like get another assist or rebound. And the Mavericks did start to blow a pretty sizable lead. I can't remember what their lead was in this game, but at one point it had got up to like almost 20 points, right?
I know it was sitting at 18 for a long time. I feel like we got over the 20-point echelon in that third quarter, but I'm honestly not sure.
Yeah. So it was kind of teetering around that range, and the Mavericks definitely started playing with their food to an extent. Jason Kidd left Hardy in tandem with a group of, some of the lower guys on the bench like McKinley Wright, and I think Pinson out there for kind of an elongated stretch. And after, he came in to let Luka get his triple-double, which, I'm not, some people were like really mad about that on Twitter. I'm not really one who cares about, if you're one assist away from a triple-double, like, sure, like, it is what it is.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I get, yes, in all technicality, you're chasing stats, but, I don't feel like it disrupted the flow of the game so much that it was like, oh, Luka's costing us the game. Like, it was like one or two possessions where he's trying to get an assist. So, and, and the Mavericks did, start to let the Pelicans back in there late, but they were luckily and fortunately enough for them, especially amidst all the recent happenings in these late game scenarios in the NBA. Look no further than the Cavs game when Mitchell had 71, and the Raptors game the other night, and Luka's game versus the Knicks, where teams are just blowing these crazy leads late in games. But the Mavericks were luckily able to right the ship and come away with the victory in this one. How many other, what other thoughts do you take from this Pelicans game before we move on to the OKC game?
Yeah, down the stretch, the Mavericks were able to hit their free throws, whether it was Theo Pinson or whoever it was. Like we had said before, this is a really good offensive game, and just not so good defensive game. Other than that, like, I really don't have any takeaways. I think this was probably one of the better team overall wins, and probably the recent past few games. But nonetheless, it was a good win, one to get over New Orleans. But this game that we're about to talk about wasn't so good. But yeah, nonetheless, I just felt like it was a good offensive game, good game to see Luka, sort of not just be total, him basically matching up or basically him, against everybody, but Christian Wood was able to get in there, I just think it was a good team win overall.
Yeah, no, and one guy, I can't believe that we failed to cover this within the whole summation of the Pelicans.
I know
game.
you're gonna say,
but of course, Jaden Hardy, we
did
not even like. Obviously, we can't glance over that in his fourth quarter effort. So we'll get into that here in a second, of course, before we wrap up the Pelicans game in totality. But he played fairly well in the OKC game, so I feel like we just kind of look at that from a holistic standpoint, and we can honestly open that conversation up a little bit in terms of how his standing is in the rotation and just on the roster in general, like what he means to the team, because him playing like this, I think, warrants a bigger discussion versus, we had a good game. Shout out to Tim Hardaway Jr. He came along in the Thunder game, but it was very volatile in terms of him making like 2 shots in a row, then missing 5 terrible shots. But in the Pelicans game, he obviously wasn't being asked to be some sort of prolific sort of offensive threat. With Luka, mirroring his minutes, and he definitely played a lot more complimentary, and he had a good shooting game, and that's just a typical Tim Hardaway Jr. good shooting game. He wasn't operating outside of the realm of like shots that you would like him to take. Went 7 for 9 at 18 points. So I thought he played a good game. Spencer definitely played second fiddle to Luka a lot more in that one, where he was kind of just pushing the tempo and transition. Let Luka and Christian did most of the work, but he didn't really need to do much. So it kind of was what it was to an extent. And I think both of those guys had bigger roles in the Thunder game that we'll be getting into right here, along with how Jaden Hardy's performance could basically expedite his role within this team. So, kind of just going off before we get specifically into this Thunder game, Jaren, what did you see from Jaden Hardy at the end of this Pelicans game? He was kind of able to basically be the guy that sealed that Mavericks game, in a game where the lead was definitely up in the air at points with the Mavericks, succumbing to their late game tendencies to start and, blow double-digit leads. He gets his number called upon, and he actually has a really good end game performance right after Kemba Walker gets waived. Not something that we want to dive into heavily, but Kemba's contract was non-guaranteed I believe that as of Saturday, January 7th, they had to make a decision as to whether he would be fully guaranteed for the rest of the season or whether they wanted to waive him. And the Mavericks, with the flexibility route, opted to waive him after just seeing the limitations of his knee. He played well in a few games here, but you could definitely tell that there was a shelf life just in terms of how much longer his NBA career has because of his knee.
Yeah.
Jaden Hardy came in basically instantaneously right after that. It was literally the day, I think like a day or so after that happened, and comes in and has 15 points in like 15 minutes. Shook up Herb Jones at one point. Was just like uber efficient scoring on all three levels. Getting to the basket was really like one of the quicker first steps out of anybody on this Mavericks roster. He has a really good ability to just be able to come off a screen and get downhill or attacking off a closeout a few times. He was able to just kind of catch it wherever. And if the defender was slipping whatsoever as they were closing out on him, or they just didn't have, they weren't completely stable and, down in a defensive stance, then, he was going to be able to blow past him. So, I mean, you were seeing flashes of why this guy was a number 3 recruit coming out of high school.
Yeah.
How impressed were you by his performance in the Pelicans game?
I mean, one thing that really, really impresses me about him is just how, NBA ready he is. I know he played a year in the G League and everything, but even still, he's a young guy. You see his rookie mishaps, I should say. But even still, just his ability to get to the basket, doesn't matter who's on him. Herb Jones was a really astounding defender in this league, and he pretty much shook him off and easily got to the basket. He makes some really tough layups. And just, how efficient he is at the basket. I know majority of his points come with inside the paint, but they're not easy buckets. He's getting bodied. I forget who it was, but I don't think it was like Valanciunas. It may have been Jackson Hayes or Hernan Gomez or someone, but he got like bodied midair and still got the layup to go. And I don't know how it was not an N1, but I mean, just the way that this guy, he can hold his body up in midair pretty much and throw it in. I mean, I don't want to say this, but he definitely has like little tiny glimpses of, John Morant and just the way he can kind of put the ball in midair. But nonetheless, the ability for him to just kind of come in and score super efficiently and honestly easily, and like it looks really easy for him. I think it's, it makes you only, I guess, more hungry to see more minutes. And, I know barring, some rookie mishaps and some stupid mistakes here and there, defensively, he's honestly looked pretty good too. He has pretty active hands. He's able to get a few steals whenever he shouldn't, I should say. I know that, defensively, it was like his big stepping stone coming into the NBA was, how good was his defense going to be? But, I want to say, I mean, it's not great, but I've been impressed with what I've seen.
No, 100%. I mean, obviously there are still a few patches to be filled, as we saw.
Yeah.
It's really going to vary on a game to game basis, but I think my takeaway from all of this is that he is a lot better than I think I would have predicted at this point in the season. Not from like, I think the mistakes just aren't eating him up as much as they thought. We still see them, like particularly in this Thunder game that we'll be getting into. He had a few times where it's not even as much like being indecisive as much just making the wrong decision, or he attacked the rim a few times and just got absolutely like swatted by like a Muscala or Jalen Williams. Like there were a few times where he just made some like preemptive based decisions and attack the rim when he shouldn't, or, try to split a double team when he shouldn't. And it led to turnovers or the ball going the other way for the Thunder off a missed shot or something of that nature. But overall, his skill set is, is one that's very desirable and not one that's easily attainable. And I think that now that his efficiency has increased and he's starting to shoot it a little better from the NBA level after, that rough stint with the G League Ignite that basically tanked his value down so low in coming into the 2022 NBA draft, we're seeing that he honestly is kind of tailor-made to be a guy that can contribute on, I mean, a handful of rosters in the NBA, maybe not every single winning roster. Like I'm sure like it would be harder for him to get like minutes on like a Pelicans, for instance, of course. But I mean, I think that, amidst the whole Kemba thing, like I'm not ready to label Hardy as the needed third ball handler / shot creator, because he still has some leaps and bounds he's going to take in terms of passing that he needs to progress within. But I would like to dispel the narrative that he, is only on the court for developmental reasons at this point, because I mean, I really do think that he can contribute to winning on this Mavericks team. I think, amidst some of the rough things that we've seen from him, just with some rookie mistakes and stuff, like he's looked, even if it is just a little stretch, like the things that he's showing on the court are very much talent based. They're things that look like inherent to him. They don't look like it's like, oh, he's just getting lucky shooting right now. Like, no, I mean, he's like finishing really tough and getting by some of the top defenders in the league, maybe not on a night in and night out basis, but I mean, at least like he's showing those flashes every single game, regardless if it's a better or a worse shooting game for him. And I just think that the narrative needs to flip in terms of how we're treating him, kind of as this like, run of the mill second round pick who, we're kind of just taking a flyer on. Like, I mean, he has potential to be part of this team's future, and he has a lot of potential in terms of how his developmental trajectory ends up going, in terms of how how good he ends up going along that path. That could really bode like very positively for the Mavericks. He does, I tweeted this, and it does sound outlandish to an extent, but I'm not saying that this is what he's going to become by any means. I want to preface that completely, but I mean, you look at the skill set and take all the variables into account, just in terms of how good he is already, only being 20 years old. Like I really don't think it's that much of a far-fetched to say that he has all-star potential one day.
I mean, it's a big statement, but
I mean, if you're saying potential, like you're not.
Well, potential. Okay. Well,
yeah, I'm not projecting that he's going to be that for sure. Like
I think,
could obviously take a turn for the worse, but I think that it's definitely a talking point that's we're going to start to see persist as the next few years start to ensue.
I think, the way that Hardy can score pretty much, at ease, I think is really boding him well. I mean, this is year one. If he can get, from here on out, or from, all-star break on up, if he can get just a 10 to 15 minute role, I mean, it's year one. The fact that, I think, granted, we didn't even think that he'd get a role at the start of the season, and this is by far the biggest role he's had all season. I think we'll see him elevate into not a bigger role, but I think we'll see him elevate into, getting that 10 to 15, being that, quote unquote third ball handler. I'm not saying he's gonna be that this season, but
I think the Mavericks have the ability to use him in some different areas, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is kind of pessimistic to say to an extent, because of just how much, negatively this guy has regressed. But I mean, like him and McKinley Wright have like, I'm not proclaiming Hardy as a, insanely positive defender, but I mean, they both look better than like Reggie Bullock on defense at times. Both of those guys, varying on the game, of course, because Tim does have some really good shooting games, but sometimes you take those guys' offensive production over Tim, depending on the night, if Tim's just shooting. Yeah. So like, and while I don't think he can maybe relieve some ball handling duties when he catches it, in terms of being able to attack off closeout, like he had like a really nice dish to Powell last night in the pick and roll. I don't think we're going to be necessarily seeing him operate like as a point of attack ball handler. Like we've seen him even when he's playing with like Luka, or then when he's kind of playing off ball, but using him as a guy that can attack a mismatch and you can draw plays up to shoot for occasionally, whilst not being a liability on defense, is definitely a role player. If we're not even like talking about the need for him to get minutes for his development, that the Mavericks can use at this stage in the season, even if it is just maybe in a 10 to 15 minute a game role, because of how he offers some wing elements. He also offers some guard elements. And I mean, the Mavericks need both of those.
Yeah, both those. Yeah.
Use a guy on both of those positions pretty badly.
Yeah. I mean, to me, Hardy's, of course, it's all about development and everything, and developing, him for future, of course. But at this point, if he can find himself a role, I mean, when is it, this guy's actually, giving to a winning team? I feel like in that Pelicans game and the Celtics game, we definitely saw a winning player on a winning team in that case. But I mean, time will tell. His Thunder game with 27 minutes definitely wasn't the best, but even still, I mean, we saw glimpses of who he could be.
No, 100%. What did you have to make of the Thunder game if we're just going to go ahead and segue into that conversation? Another non-Luka game where the output of what the Mavericks displayed on the floor definitely matched Luka not being out there. I think the offense at times was groggy, and you could see his lack of presence definitely being felt just in terms of the shots that were being created and where the offense was coming from. But I will say as much that I thought one bright spot was Christian Wood. I mean, there's been a couple, I think this may be like the second Luka game that he was playing in, to my recollection, that he did pretty decent in. And it was really interesting to see how, admittedly against a kind of a smaller, like less, definitely like a less strong, Oklahoma City front court, but he was taking advantages of mismatches that, he was kind of given. And at the same time, he was doing just a really good job of operating, just strictly as an isolation player, and, not having a lot of turnovers, not having a lot of bad shots. Like, he was the main source of offense for the Mavericks, which as a big is not easy to do in today's NBA to an extent. And, while he wasn't like facilitating or doing any of the just, Embiid or Jokic like things that, would be, more emblematic of like an insane, sort of offensive powerhouse. It was interesting to see that the Mavericks did have the ability to go to him with Luka out, and he could still produce on that end of the floor.
Yeah, Christian Wood, you just look at the free throw numbers. He's able to get to the line 12 times. To me, that stat points out because Christian Wood is able to kind of, punish the isolation a little bit more. And this game, whenever he's playing with Luka, we definitely see him be more of a pick and pop or pick and roll player. But in this game, you don't have Luka. You got Spencer Dinwiddie, and Dinwiddie, when what he does. Christian Wood was, able to really punish whoever was really defending on him. I mean, at times, the Thunder don't really have a natural center on this current roster that they have. So we got to see, Omarui, or I don't know how to say his name, but him, Mike Muscala, guys like that. And, Christian Wood is able to beat them off the front foot. And he had 27 points in this. And a lot of it was, inside the paint, but inside the paint being aggressive.
Yeah, I mean, he only made 1 3 tonight. A lot of it was, identifying a mismatch, making that drop step, really furbishing himself inside. Being able to seal guys, at that elbow area to where, or on the baseline to where he could just, make a spin move and dunk it. And I mean, he was doing a good job in the scenarios where the Mavericks did run like a pick and roll with him and Dinwiddie at points in this game. He did a really good job, sticking to his principles, even if Dinwiddie is, not as dynamic of a lob passer as Doncic, of course. Like, we know Spencer Dinwiddie's limitations as a passer. Like, it's kind of hit or miss just in terms of his strict passing ability. Like, he's a good job getting guys in their spots, being, that kind of playmaker, initiator type of guy. But we obviously know that sometimes he has some definite limitations in terms of his ability to throw a lob or an entry pass. So it was really cool to see Christian Wood still be able to really open things up for himself in a game where Luka is at. I think it definitely points towards a continued increase and a sense of comfortability within the Mavericks offensive system, which is always good to see, especially as those questions definitely persisted at the beginning of the season when he wasn't starting. Like, how sustainable is his long-term fit in Dallas? Like, I mean, I think that to an extent, he's like one of those guys that, he's a pretty talented player. Like, if he's on the court, then, the fit definitely has to work itself out to an extent. And I mean, offensively with Luka, obviously, I think it's pretty like self-evident that they work great together. Like I don't think that there's much contest to it. You can argue some of the defensive limitations he has. He's not sustainable as a like pure just defensive five in the NBA who's going to be your rim protector and the guy that's going to be able to switch on to every single guy in the perimeter. He's not a Rob Williams who's just going to be this jack of all trades defender and be just a peak idealistic fit. But I mean, surrounded by another rim protector, he could really fit very seamlessly on both sides of the ball for the Mavericks, because we're already seeing how the offensive fit is coming to a premium with him and Doncic. And I mean, even in games where Doncic, I don't think Christian Wood could do this consistently, but to be able to put up 27 and 17 in a game where Doncic is out, I mean, it's pretty wildly impressive despite the Thunder's lack of a really prevalent front court. So that was really exciting to see. But I honestly thought he was like one of the lone positives in this game versus Oklahoma City, where the Mavericks were just sort of hard pressed to be able to generate anything on both sides of the ball that looked competent compared to the Thunder. The Mavericks tried to go to zone a few times to limit SGA there early, but that didn't seem like it was. I mean, it panned out fairly okay, but the second that they switched back to man, I mean, they didn't really have anybody that could guard him, whether they threw Reggie or Tim on him, and there's not many guys in the league that can guard him. Frank was able to put up a little bit of a battle against him, but that's not something that I'm really going to really draw a huge indictment upon the Mavericks for, as he is not an easy player to guard by any means, just in terms of his versatility and dynamic ability to get into the lane at all costs and facilitate from there and create shots for himself at all three levels. He hasn't even really opened up his 3-point shooting as much as you may have hoped for at this stage in his career. And so the fact that he's still doing this is quite insane, but that much, seeing that sort of output from SGA was definitely expected. But the Mavericks, I mean, suffered in all facets. They weren't really, they were late on rotations.
Yeah.
They seemed like they were just kind of getting mixed up in all sort of, in all the levels defensively that the Mavericks should get mixed up. They were not doing a good job rotating, like I had alluded to. They didn't do a good job bringing help. They let Jalen Williams, Lou Dort get to the basket at ease. And when they did go back to that zone a little bit at points in the second half, it didn't seem as aggressive and ready-made to stop SGA. It kind of seemed like they were just out there wandering around in their specific areas. And I thought the Thunder did a good job of getting the ball to the middle of the floor and making things happen from there. There were like some pull-up jumpers from Isaiah Joe, Lindy Waters III, who I did not know was an NBA player until last night, and Kenrich Williams, who all did a really good job in terms of benefiting off Lou Dort, Jalen Williams, Josh Giddey, and SGA being able to attack, penetrate, and kick to those guys for them to take some pull-up mid-rangers and some threes. And, Trey Mann off the bench, the fact that he only plays 14 minutes for them is definitely a luxury for a team that, I don't really want to say that they're limited personnel-wise, but they're very young. But at the same time, they have a lot of talent despite their youth, right? And I mean, Trey Mann, he would get, I think Trey Mann he would play a lot of minutes on this Mavericks team.
For sure.
And I mean, he is a guy who they only have the luxury of having to really only play about 15 minutes, and he can come in and kind of just fill it up, very like Tyus Jones-esque in terms of his game, being able to, just go in there and score and facilitate, even if he's not as much of a defender. And, Aaron Wiggins, was able to make some threes. Like they have a, sort of a plethora of these wings and guards that all offer something just a little bit different. But I mean, like, nonetheless, like when surrounded by some guys that can really run the table in terms of facilitating, playmaking, getting things out, pushing the ball in transition, and like Giddey, SGA, and even Dort at times, like when you surround those type of guys around those three guys, It's going to generate a lot of open looks for the Mavericks for the Thunder. And the Mavericks do not have the defensive personnel or ability to really counter any of that right now. And I mean, we saw this in this game where the Thunder, I think, made, it doesn't tell me the exact amount. Oh, here it goes. I mean, they went 12 for 28 on threes tonight, but
Yeah.
I mean, it definitely seemed as if they were just shooting the ball holistically, like, from that mid-range area and from the 3-point line, a lot better than that number. And that the Mavericks really didn't have any answers for it.
No, for sure. Alluding back to the, zone defense that the Mavericks started to play throughout the game, we definitely saw Shea's sort of, shot. He didn't shoot as many field goals as I feel like he usually does. Again, I don't watch Thunder games. I don't know how much he usually shoots, but he only got up 17 shots. He's just uber efficient. He's able to, get other guys involved by kicking out. And that's whenever we saw these sort of pull-up jumpers being made. And yeah, I mean, the defense that the Mavericks have right now, they just don't have the luxury to kind of, defend all three levels. I've said this many times, they just have to commit to one thing. They started playing the zone, of course, and Shai Gilgeous being Shai Gilgeous, he's able to easily get inside and I mean efficiently shoot and get 33 points in the game. But yeah, I mean, we saw Kenrich Williams, Jalen Williams, a lot of these guys, able to be really effective at the mid-range level just because of, the sort of effect that, Shai Gilgeous has pretty much. And I mean, these guys, they create off-ball movements for themselves, something that I don't feel like the Mavericks do a whole lot of. And I mean, that's, one luxury that the Thunder have. I mean, I don't know how much credence there is to this because the Thunder, they're of course aren't as star-studded as the Mavericks are, but to me, it's safe to say that the Thunder are probably a deeper roster than the Mavericks are. And we saw that in this one.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, I think even with Luka, you could definitely say the Thunder are deeper. Maybe
they're deeper. Yeah.
While the Mavericks are obviously more top heavy, maybe more talented, like the Thunder definitely are deeper. And I think that goes for a lot of teams in this league. The Mavericks definitely need to replenish their depth because I mean, they're, even when healthy, like they're a strict, like, come playoff time, like they're an 8-man rotation. And, obviously you reduce your rotations come playoff time. You're only playing like 7 to 8 guys, of course. But I mean, the Mavericks don't really even have the ability to like put any guy out there. And, outside of those top 8 guys, when Maxey, Dorian, and Josh are healthy, and like be comfortable doing so. Like you'd be like, oh, this guy's going in the game a little hesitant versus like a lot of these teams are that are like 12 deep. I mean, they can afford to take on a couple injuries versus the Mavericks. Like you see, like when a few of their defensive role players get injured, it really starts to hamper them severely. And we start seeing games like this, particularly in a game that Luka misses, in a game where Spencer Dinwiddie and Tim Hardaway Jr. were asked to carry a burden of the offensive creation in this one. They ended up going, I guess, would it be 12 for 34 in this game? Yeah. So I guess just a shade under 33% from the field. You would like to see those numbers increase. We obviously saw Tim have like a very like up and down shooting game after his performance against the Pelicans, where he shot the ball pretty well, especially in a game where he's being asked to attack more and, having to come off like some screen set for him as the ball handler a little more without Doncic, where, if a guy goes under, he's shooting that thing immediately. Spencer, I mean, he did decent in this game. We're starting to see his shooting regress a little bit, but, in a game where Luka left a huge void of offensive creation, I didn't think it was like a terrible Spencer game, but I think Spencer may need to do a little bit better of a job just in terms of like, I think at the beginning of the season, I felt like he was doing a much better job distinguishing like what exactly to do when he was on offense, if that makes any sense. Like he was, when he got a mismatch on a bigger defender, he was attacking, right? Now it seems at times like he's indecisive, like he's almost just trying to bait a foul every time he gets the ball at points, where he just basically throws it up the second anything gets called, which I mean, it's smart, of course, but I think I would like to just see him tried to get to the rim a little more. I think once he started shooting the ball well, it gave him an increased sense of comfortability to be able to take more of these mid-rangers and more of these threes, which isn't a bad thing, but his strong suit is getting to the rim and using that to open up things for him. So I think he could do that a little better. But besides that, I don't have a ton of complaints. He put up 21 and 8 in a game where Luka was out. I thought he did a fairly decent job running the offense. I mean, outside of that, Dwight Powell kind of got into, he's just really hard pressed to be able to make an impact without Luka on the floor. I mean, he facilitates almost all his offense. That's not taking away from Dwight Powell's ability to roll or anything, but I mean, he's just not, his ability to roll kind of gets negated, especially against a switch heavy team like the Thunder that are going to have, some smaller, more quick footed guys that are going to be able to stay with him. It's going to be a lot harder for him to open up the lob game, versus Christian Wood, who obviously has that dynamic offensive ability to be able to score regardless if Luka isn't there. Reggie made a few threes in this game, but he fell off like very quickly after that and didn't really do much else, missed his next few and was not able to play good defense. Jaden Hardy, he played decent but he honestly didn't get like a huge crack at the tree here. He was definitely he played like 30 minutes, but I don't know. He didn't have a bad game per se, but he just wasn't shooting as good as he did in that Pelicans game. And he did have a few rookie woes, like we had alluded to, and just in terms of making some bad decisions, like trying to attack when he shouldn't have. Frank played a few good defensive minutes, made a few shots. Davis came in and rained in a few threes. Obviously, that was so cringe when he said that. I know that. I'm sorry. I completely forgot about that. But he was doing a good job coming off some pin downs and nailing them for once. I feel like Davis I think last year, he at least had a few decent defensive games. Like this year, you can just see how much of a true liability he is on that end every single game. We don't harp on it enough just because of we expect him to be that bad. But it was funny that he actually is that bad on night in, night out basis. But at least in this game, he made a few threes because his 3-point shooting, just his shot, the shots he takes are so difficult. If the Mavericks had their full array of players, I think that he would definitely be the benefactor of some more open threes, but they run so much pin downs and off ball screens for him to come off, and he's shooting just going full speed ahead. I get running that sort of stuff for him because of as good of a shooter as he is, but it limits his effectiveness to an extent. I think to be a little more efficient, I'd like to see him involved in a little more. I know it's hard to get a guy like him open, but I'd like to see the Mavericks make a concerted effort to get him the ball in scenarios where he's not, running as fast as he can, trying to move around 8 screens to shoot, just to increase his productivity a little bit. But good for him that he had a better shooting game. But outside of that, it was just the Mavericks were hard pressed to be able to defend the Thunder in this game, especially when their role players started making threes, and they just didn't have any sort of engine of offense without Doncic there. And that's barely the summation of the game. It doesn't really go much deeper than that. It was a Luka-less game, and you saw that the left ankle soreness, the Mavericks were resting him on the second night of a back-to-back. It was a pretty expected outcome in terms of how this game finished. What do you think, Jaren?
No, yeah, the Mavericks, of course, in that first quarter, they did some good things, but just as the game progressed, it very quickly fell apart. I felt like Spencer early on did a good job of, kind of facilitating the offense. And then again, like I said it earlier, just very quickly fell apart. We saw some positives, like you mentioned before, with Bertans. But Frank Ntilikina had some good defensive minutes here and there. Christian Wood was really the only true positive in this one, outside of Tim Hardaway's third quarter shooting. As you said, it's just a Luka-less game. I think the Mavericks are 0-4 now without Luka in the game.
Yeah.
There's really not much else to say than that. The Oklahoma City just flat out beat us.
No, 100%. And Luka is questionable tomorrow night for the Clippers game, so I didn't know that the left ankle soreness was actually going to be something that persisted to multiple games. So I do hope he plays because he is sorely needed at this point. They can't really afford to have him out for any sort of elongated stretch, especially with those other injuries right now. I mean, even if those other guys were back, they're just hard pressed to be able to survive without him. They're stripped of their play style. The heliocentrism definitely goes away, and you're just left with a bunch of guys out there trying to, generate a semblance of offense compared to what this team is when, you have your primary source of energy coming from Luka. And I mean, it's unfortunate, but the Mavericks just don't have Christian Wood is a really good player. And I mean, there are a handful of teams that are actually decent in this league that he could be a second best player on. I don't know if I'd go as far as say he's can be a second best player on a championship team. I don't think he can, but he can definitely be a third or a fourth best, but he's not a lead, ball handler, and he's not, like one of those centers that, can be your primary generator of offense, at all three levels of the game, like a Jokic or Embiid. He's a guy who can, take advantage of mismatches, do good down low, but he's not going to be a guy that, by himself is going to be able to carry the Mavericks in games like that. And I mean, it just points towards the Mavericks really just needing another ball handler, preferably one that can get their own shot, because, in games like this, you can see where the lack of that definitely bites the Mavericks in the behind. I mean, it's pretty irrefutable. When you see these Luka-less games, it's hard to watch at times, and especially in a game where everybody's watching the NFL yesterday, it almost seemed as if it was that was definitely one of the more burden-ish games to watch.
Yeah, I was just like,
I was like, oh man. Besides the Jaden Hardy minutes, it was very unexciting. But we appreciate you guys listening to the podcast. Of course, make sure to follow us and on Twitter at mainstream_Mavs. Subscribe to us and like the video and comment down below if you're on YouTube. We appreciate y'all's support if you're on that platform. If you're on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever listening platform you guys listen to, make sure to subscribe to us and give us a 5-star rating if you are so inclined and you enjoy our contests or our content. Oh my God, our content rather. Thank you for listening this far in the podcast. We may be back tonight to do our
I'm cool.
Our 41 games, our overview of the season halfway through. We'll either do that tonight or we will combine tomorrow night's episode in the Mavericks versus Clippers game with that. Preferably, I'd like to do it tonight, but we'll kind of see how that ends up shaking out, guys. But stay tuned for that, and we will catch you guys in the next one.
Bye-bye.